At the iron-cold taste of blood in a child's mouth is a soundless scream louder than any engine I've ever revved. It was exactly 7:14 p.m., and the road through the Appalachian foothills was a lonely, unforgiving stretch of blacktop that seemed to swallow both sound and light in equal measure. And in these mountains, the sun doesn't just set, it makes a jagged, violet descent behind the peaks, leaving the valleys in a thick and ink-black silence that has a physical weight to it. I was leading my custom Harley into a tight hair-pin curve and, feeling the familiar vibration of the frame and the scent of damp pine needles mixed with cooling asphalt, when the piercing beam of my headlight caught a sudden and sharp flash of movement in the tall, yellowed grass near a rusted drainage pipe. I've lived a life that taught me to trust my gut long before I trust my eyes, and right then, my instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong in the heart of these woods. I pulled over, and, the gravel crunching under my heavy tires like the sound of breaking bone, and flicked on my high beams to cut through the oppressive mountain dark. There, and huddled deep in the mouth of that cold concrete pipe, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, a tiny, shivering silhouette against the gray stone, and he was trembling so violently that I could actually hear his teeth chattering over the low, rhythmic idle of my V-twin engine. But it was his face, and illuminated by the harsh LED glow, that made the blood in my veins turn to liquid nitrogen in a heartbeat. His lip was split wide open, a dark and jagged line of dried blood crusting over his chin and staining the front of his tattered T-shirt. One eye was swollen completely shut, turning a deep and angry shade of purple that looked like a storm cloud on his skin. He wasn't crying for help, he wasn't making a sound at all, and he was just staring at the road with a look of pure, unadulterated terror, the kind of look you only see in the eyes of a creature that's been hunted for far too long. And as if this boy's story is already hitting you in the chest and making your blood boil, stop for a moment and drop a comment saying Pierotat te healdron below. And we need to show the world that the Motor Mafia and this brotherhood stand as a wall for the innocent. Your voice matters in this fight. And when I knelt down in the dirt and reached out a hand, he didn't pull away. He grabbed my leather sleeve with a grip that was desperate and bone deep, and his small voice cracking as he whispered the 4 words that would ignite a war in this valley. "Please don't go. He's coming back," and he said he'd finish it when the sun went down. I didn't have to ask who was. I've spent 20 years on the road, and I've seen that look before, and the look of a child who has been turned into a punching bag by someone who was supposed to be his protector, and someone who hid behind the word father while acting like a monster. I lifted the boy, his name was Toby, into my arms, and he felt as light as a handful of dry leaves, and as if the fear had eaten away at his very weight. He was so small, so fragile against the heavy leather of my vest, and I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He told me through ragged, shallow gasps that his stepfather, a local meth cooker named Caleb, and had spent the entire afternoon teaching him a lesson, because Toby had accidentally spilled a glass of water on the kitchen floor, and Caleb had gone into town to get more supplies, promising the boy that when he returned under the cover of darkness, Toby wouldn't be able to walk for a week, and Toby had crawled out of a back window while the trailer was quiet and run until his lungs felt like they were on fire, and eventually hiding in the only place he felt the darkness couldn't find him. He was terrified of the light, terrified of the road, and terrified that the monster would see him. As I listened to his jagged breaths, and I felt a rage rising up in my chest that was hotter than the chrome exhaust pipes on my bike. It wasn't just anger, it was a cold, calculated sense of duty, and I didn't even think about calling the local sheriff. In this part of the country, where the trailers are hidden deep in the hollows, and the law was often related to the criminals by blood or by money, I knew for a fact that Caleb had cousins wearing badges in the local precinct, and men who would look the other way for a taste of his profits. No, and this wasn't a job for a slow, moving system that would just file a report and put Toby back in that trailer 48 hours later. And this was a job for the only family I knew that didn't care about politics, paperwork, or the proper way of doing things. I reached for the radio clipped to my shoulder, and my fingers feeling thick and clumsy with fury. I hit the emergency override for the Motor Mafia chapter, the channel we reserve for life and death situations. and my voice was a low, dangerous growl as I spoke into the mic. "This is Jax. I have a stray lamb with a split lip and a monster on his trail, and I'm at the drainage pipe on Old Creek Road. I'm taking him to the dilapidated trailer at the very end of Miller's Creek, and I want every man who can twist a throttle to meet me there. I don't just want a presence, I want an unbreakable fortress. This monster is coming back at midnight, and I want him to find 94 reasons why he'll never touch this boy again." The silence that followed on the radio was only for a second, but it was the heaviest second of my life. I looked down at Toby, who was watching me with wide, unblinking eyes, his hands still white, knuckled around my leather cuff, and he didn't know who I was talking to, but he could feel the shift in the air. He could feel that the lone man on the bike was no longer alone. I tucked him into my sidecar and, wrapping him in a heavy, grease-scented wool blanket I kept for the long winter hauls, and I whispered to him that he was safe now. I told him that from this moment on, he had 94 fathers, and none of them were ever going to let him hurt again. He didn't believe me, not yet, but as I kicked my engine to life, the roar of the Harley seemed to settle him, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the sounds of the dark woods, and I clicked the bike into gear and began the slow ride toward Miller's Creek, knowing that behind me, the earth was already beginning to tremble with the approach of the iron flock. The response from the club was a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks over the airwaves, and 94 separate brothers acknowledging the call in a sequence that sounded like the mechanical heartbeat of a giant. There were no questions, no hesitations, and no bureaucratic excuses. In the world of the Motor Mafia, when a brother calls for help regarding a child, the rest of the world ceases to exist. I looked at Toby, and his small face barely visible under the heavy wool blanket, and I saw a flicker of something in his one good eye. Not quite hope yet, but a stunned curiosity. And he had spent his life thinking the world was a place of shadows and heavy hands, and he was about to see the light of 94 suns. As we began the slow and deliberate crawl toward Miller's Creek Road, the silence of the mountain was suddenly shattered by a sound that started as a low and subsonic hum in the soles of my feet and grew into a thunderous, earth-shaking roar that seemed to vibrate the very trees. From the north, the south, and the hidden fire trails of the foothills, the headlights began to appear like a celestial army emerging from the mist. One by one, then 10 by 10, and the chrome and steel arrived, 94 Hell's Angels, riding in a tight, lethal formation that stretched for nearly half a mile, and their engines creating a frequency that felt like it was resetting the rhythm of my own heart. And before we get to the moment the monster returned to find an army waiting for him, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and comment your location below so we know where our global Motor Mafia family is riding from. Your support is the fuel that helps us protect the innocent. And they didn't just pull up to the trailer, they occupied the entire territory with a military precision that would have made a combat veteran stare in awe, and they swarmed the sack, tires screaming against the dirt as they banked their heavy machines, creating a perfect, iron semicircle around Toby's front door, and 94 bikes idling in a low, predatory growl, a sound that translated to, "Don't move," in every language known to man, and it was a wall of steel and muscle that turned a forgotten shack into the most secure fortress in the state. And I pulled the street glide to a halt right at the center of the arc, and the silence that followed when 94 kickstands hit the dry earth at the exact same moment was the heaviest sound I've ever heard, and it was the sound of a promise being kept. Big Mac, our chapter president, a man who looked like he'd been forged in a furnace and tempered in oil, and was the first to dismount. He stood 6'5", his leather cut strained against his massive chest, and he didn't need a briefing. And he saw Toby's split lip in the glow of my headlight. He saw the deep, ugly swelling in the boy's eye, and he simply looked at the brothers and nodded. Within minutes, the perimeter was locked down tighter than a death-row wing. We had brothers positioned on the rusted roof of the trailer, their silhouettes sharp against the moon, and we had brothers disappearing into the dark tree line like ghosts, and 40 men standing in a literal wall of leather, denim, and in raw muscle directly across the front doorstep. Toby's mother, Elena, came to the door then, and she was a woman who looked like she'd been carrying the weight of the mountain on her back for a decade, and her face was a heartbreaking map of fresh bruises and silver white scars, each one a chapter of Caleb's cruelty. When she stepped onto that porch and saw the bikes, and when she saw the death's head patches reflecting the pale moonlight, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She fell to her knees right there on the splintered wood and sobbing into her hands, not out of fear of us, but out of the sheer, soul-crushing realization that for the first time in her life, someone had shown up to fight for her, and we didn't waste a second. I carried Toby onto the porch, his small hand still clutching my vest, and handed him to Elena. The way she held him, and like he was the last bit of air in a drowning room, made every man in that yard tighten his grip on his handlebars. We brought them both inside, and Doc, and our club medic who had spent years patching up soldiers under fire, went to work. He didn't just treat the split lip, he treated the spirit, and he cleaned Toby's wounds with a tenderness that defied his rough exterior, talking to the boy in a low, soothing voice about the different bikes parked outside, and he sat with Elena, his hands steady as he checked her for internal injuries, his presence alone acting as a barrier against the trauma, But while the inside of the trailer was a sanctuary of healing, the air outside was thickening with a different kind of energy. The wind shifted, bringing the sharp and metallic scent of ozone and the heavy odor of burnt grease. From the bottom of the valley, we heard the sound we'd been waiting for, the high-pitched and rattling whine of Caleb's beat-up pickup truck. The monster was coming home to finish it, but he was about to find out that the sun hadn't just gone down, and it had been replaced by a storm he couldn't survive. Caleb didn't know the world had changed while he was in town buying his chemicals and feeding his demons. And he rounded the final bend in the creek road, his rusted Ford F-150 bouncing violently over the ruts, the engine screaming as he pushed it up the incline, and he was likely rehearsing the terrors he was going to inflict on a helpless boy and a broken woman, but as his high beams hit the wall of chrome and leather that now occupied his entire reality, his world came to a screeching, terrifying halt, and he slammed on his brakes so hard the truck fishtailed in the red dirt, sending a massive cloud of dust into the air that shimmered like a ghost in his headlights. And he sat there for a long, stunned moment, the engine of his truck coughing and sputtering like a dying animal, and, looking through the cracked windshield at the 94 bikers who were staring back at him with cold, unblinking eyes. And he was a small man made big by a cowardly heart and a chemical habit, and as he stepped out of the truck clutching a heavy tire iron, and he realized too late that his reign of terror had just come to a violent, absolute end. The silence of the mountain was now owned by us, and it was a silence that felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, and, if your heart is racing right now, and you believe in the power of the Brotherhood to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and hit that like button and comment keep UOING to hear how we handled Caleb and the legacy we left behind, and your support is what gives us the strength to keep the wolves away from the door us. This is private property, he screamed, and, his voice cracking and shifting into a high-pitched, pathetic whine as he tried his shivering behind a mask of hollow bravado. He waved the tire iron in the air, but it looked like a toothpick compared to the wall of iron standing before him. Get these bikes off my land or I'm calling the law. You're trespassing. And I know people. Big Mac stepped forward, the dim light from the trailer's porch illuminating the president patch on his chest like a badge of divine judgment. And he didn't raise his voice, because a man like Mac doesn't have to shout to be heard. His voice was a low and dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air in Caleb's lungs. The law isn't coming tonight, Caleb, Mac said, and the way he said his name made it sound like a death sentence. Tonight, there's only us. And we've decided that you're not allowed to live here anymore. In fact, we've decided that you're not allowed to be within 50 miles of this boy, or his mother ever again. If you so much as think about their names, and the wind will carry it back to us, and we will find you in whatever hole you try to crawl into. Caleb looked at the 94 men. He looked at the way they stood, disciplined, silent, and completely immovable, like a mountain range of leather and muscle. He looked at the shadows in the trees and the figures on his roof, realizing he was surrounded in 3 dimensions. Finally, he looked at me, standing by the sidecar where Toby was peering out from under the wool blanket, and Toby wasn't flinching anymore. For the first time, the boy saw the monsters of what he truly was, a terrified, small man standing in the light of the truth, and the tire iron fell from Caleb's trembling hand, thudding into the soft dirt with a sound of total, pathetic surrender. He tried to turn back to his truck, and, thinking he could just drive away and disappear, but two of our brothers, Tank and Slim, were already standing by his door, their arms crossed over their massive chests, and they didn't have to touch him, they just occupied the space where his escape used to be, their presence a solid wall he couldn't penetrate. And the moral complexity of the situation was clear to everyone. We were operating far outside the lines of the system, because the system had failed Toby and Alina for years. And we weren't there to be judge and jury in a court of law, we were there to be the shield that the law refused to provide. We gave Caleb a very simple choice, and one that didn't involve paperwork or lawyers. He could sign over the title to the trailer and the 2 acres of land to Alina right then and there, or he could walk into the deep woods with us and let the nature of the mountain take its course. We told him that if he signed, he got to walk away with his life, and if he didn't, well, the mountain is a very big place and people go missing in the hollows all the time. He was a coward at heart, and like all bullies, and he folded the moment he faced a force he couldn't intimidate. Under the flickering, accusatory glow of a dozen tactical flashlights, and his hand shook so hard he could barely hold the pen. But he signed the documents that stripped him of his power, his property, and his pride, and we didn't let him back in the house. We watched him pack a single, small bag of his belongings into the bed of his truck, and his footsteps splashing frantically in the mud as he moved. He knew if he ever looked back, or if his shadow ever crossed that property line again, and 94 shadows would be waiting to drag him into the dark. As his taillights faded into the blackness of the valley, a heavy sense of relief washed over the yard, but the work was far from over. We had cleared the monster, but the damage he had left behind was deep, and it was going to take more than just a signature to fix it. And we turned back toward the trailer, the iron circle opening up to let us in. We had reclaimed the land, but now we had to reclaim the lives of the people who lived on it. And the red taillights of Caleb's truck finally flickered out like dying embers as he rounded the bend, and leaving a silence behind that felt entirely different from the one I had found an hour ago. And that first silence had been heavy, with the scent of fear and the metallic tang of fresh blood, but this new silence was filled with the rhythmic breathing of 94 men who had just reclaimed a piece of the world for a child. But the Motor Mafia doesn't just clear out the trash and leave the mess behind. We are builders, fixers, and protectors. Big Mac stood in the center of the driveway, and the moonlight catching the silver in his beard as he looked at the dilapidated trailer. It was a shack of a place, a monument to neglect and chemical rot. And why aren't leaving? Mac said, his voice echoing off the nearby hills like a decree. This isn't a crime scene anymore. This is a home, and we're going to make it look like one. Most people see the leather and the tattoos, and they think they know what we're capable of, but they don't realize that a biker club is a collection of some of the best tradesmen in the country. We had master mechanics, carpenters, electricians, and guys who could weld a broken world back together. Within 30 minutes, the night was no longer silent. The low hum of engines was replaced by the sharp and industrious sounds of hammers hitting nails and the screech of old, rusted car frames being hauled away by winch cables. We didn't just guard the door, and we literally rebuilt the fortress. 2 brothers, Slim and Hammer, found a stash of plywood in Caleb's shed, and began replacing the windows that had been taped over with yellowed plastic for years. And every strike of the hammer seemed to drive a little more of Caleb's ghost out of the valley. Inside, Doc was still sitting at the kitchen table with Alina and Toby, and the smell of Caleb's meth cooking chemicals was being replaced by the scent of fresh pine sawdust and the industrial-strength cleaners the brothers had brought from their own shops. And assess here if this story is hitting you hard and you want to see more acts of justice, and comment FUMILYS EVARWHING, and share this video with someone who needs to see that there is still hope in the darkness. And your support helps us keep the wolves at bay and the engines running for those who have no one else to turn to. Assess. Toby didn't stay inside for long, and I watched him peek out from behind the screen door, his one good eye wide with a stunned sort of wonder. He saw 94 men, and men who looked like the monsters he'd been taught to fear. working with a feverish intensity to fix his world. He saw Tank, and a man whose arms were the size of Toby's entire torso, gently picking up the broken toys Caleb had smashed and setting them aside to be repaired. And Toby stepped out onto the porch, my oversized leather vest still draped over his shoulders like a suit of armor. I walked over and sat on the top step beside him, and we didn't talk at first, we just watched the brotherhood in motion. I could see the gears turning in his head. For the first time in his life, and power wasn't something used to hurt him, it was something used to heal. But the pattern interrupt in this story wasn't just the physical rebuilding of a trailer, and it was the total dismantling of the corrupt system that had allowed Caleb to thrive. About 3 hours into the work, a single police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and its blue and red lights flashing tentatively. It was Sergeant Miller, the man Toby had mentioned, the cousin who looked the other way. He stepped out of his car, and his hand on his belt, trying to project an authority that he had long ago sold for a few envelopes of Caleb's cash. "What's all this?" Miller barked, and though his voice lacked conviction when he looked at the wall of 94 bikers staring him down. "I got a report of a disturbance. You boys need to move along," and Big Mac didn't even stop what he was doing. He was holding a piece of lumber for Slim. He just looked over his shoulder, his eyes like two cold stones. "Disturbance is over, Miller," Mac said. "The trash has been taken out, and we found something under the floorboards in the shed that you might be interested in, a ledger. And it's got names, dates, and amounts. Your name is on the first page of every month." The sergeant froze, and his face turning a sickly shade of gray in the strobe light of his own cruiser. And he realized in that moment that he wasn't just dealing with a biker disturbance. He was dealing with the larger network, and we had already made digital copies of that ledger and sent them to a contact in the State Bureau of Investigation. And we told Miller that he could leave quietly and turn in his badge in the morning, or he could wait for the state troopers to arrive and do it for him. He didn't say a word, and he got back in his car and backed out of the driveway, his lights flickering off as he vanished into the night. And the transformation in Elena was the most profound part of those first 24 hours. She had spent a decade shrinking herself and trying to become invisible so she wouldn't be a target. But as she watched the brothers clearing the rusted car frames and planting a small garden in the red dirt, and she began to stand taller. She stopped looking at the floor when she spoke. She realized that she wasn't just a victim anymore, and she was the owner of 2 acres of land and a home that was finally safe. "We used the club's treasury to buy her a reliable and 4-wheel drive vehicle and stocked their pantry with enough food to last through the winter. This was the community impact that the news never reports, and we stayed for 2 weeks. Every night, at least 10 bikes were parked in that driveway, a silent and iron-rotating guard that ensured Caleb would never find the courage to crawl back. Toby started spending his days with us, learning how to check oil and polish chrome, and he wasn't hiding in drainage pipes anymore. He was standing on his own doorstep, watching the sunset, knowing that he had 94 reasons to never be afraid again. And the transformation of Miller's Creek didn't happen overnight, but it was as steady and unstoppable as a rising tide. Toby is 16 years old now, and the terrified boy I found huddled in a concrete drainage pipe is a memory that feels like it belongs to another lifetime. He doesn't have fear in his eyes anymore, and he has a sense of purpose that is as solid as the steel frame of a Harley Davidson. He's the top student in his class, a kid who excels at mathematics and engineering, and he spends every single one of his summers working at the club's authorized machine shop. He's learned a trade that will keep him on his feet for the rest of his life, but more than that, he's learned what it means to be a man of his word. He still has that faint, thin white line on his lip, a permanent reminder of where he came from, and we told him early on that it wasn't a mark of shame, it was a scar of bravery. A record of the night he was courageous enough to run through the dark to find a better life. And he wears it like a badge of honor now, a silent testament to the night 94 men chose to become his shield. He knows that on the darkest, coldest night of his life, and a brotherhood of strangers chose to be his family, and that kind of knowledge changes a person's DNA. Elena, too, is a different woman. The trailer is long gone, and replaced by a beautiful, modest small home that the brothers helped her build on their same 2 acres of land. It has a wrap around porch where she sits in the evenings, and, watching the sun dip behind the mountains without a single worry about who might be coming up the driveway. And she started a support group for women in the valley who have lived through the same shadows she did, and she's become a pillar of strength in a community that used to be defined by its silence. We don't have to keep a rotating guard detail anymore, and the message we sent that night was loud enough to last a generation. Every person in this county knows that if you lay a hand on the innocent in Miller's Creek, and you aren't just dealing with the law, you're dealing with 94 reasons to never see the sun again. And we turned a split lip and a desperate cry of, "He's coming back," into a movement of justice that fundamentally shifted the narrative of an entire region. And the legacy of that night ripples out far beyond just one family or one trailer. Once the people saw that Caleb was gone and Sergeant Miller had been stripped of his badge, and the silence finally broke, other families started reaching out to the clubhouse, whispered stories of abuse, corruption, and neglect finally seeing the light of day, because they saw that there was a force in the world that could actually make a difference. We couldn't be everywhere at once, but we didn't have to be. We helped them organize, we helped them find the resources they needed, and we made sure they knew that if the darkness ever got too thick, and there was a legion of leather and steel ready to roll over the hill at a moment's notice. We are the watchers on the highway, the guardians of the silent, and the living nightmare of those who would dare to prey on the vulnerable. Toby often rides with me now, and sitting on the pillion seat as we scout the winding mountain roads. He's learning the code, and he's learning the heavy responsibility that comes with the roar of a high-performance engine. As the sun sets over the Appalachians tonight, casting long and violet shadows across the hollows, I look in my rearview mirror and see the lights of the clubhouse glowing like a beacon in the distance, and I think about the weight of Toby's small, cold hand on my leather sleeve that first night, and the rattling, desperate whisper that changed the course of so many lives. And it is a constant reminder that one person's courage, no matter how small or broken they may feel, can ignite an entire army's resolve. We aren't just a motorcycle club, and we are a response to a world that has too often forgotten how to protect its most precious cargo. We are the shadow that protects the light, and if you ever find yourself in the dark, feeling the hot breath of a monster on your neck, just listen for the hum in the ground, and listen for the vibration in the air and the rhythmic thunder of 94 engines. Because the Motor Mafia is out there, 94 strong and growing, and we are just waiting for the call to hold the line for you. We don't leave our own, and we never, ever back down from a fight that needs to be won. And if this story moved you, and you believe that every child deserves a protector, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and share this video so more people can see these heroes in action. Which part of Toby's journey hit you the hardest, and the discovery at the drainage pipe, or the moment the 94 bikers took over the doorstep? Comment below and let's talk about it. And would you like me to start the next story about a veteran in trouble, or a girl who sent a hidden message to the clubhouse? And your engagement keeps our engines running and the road safe for everyone.
We ride for you.